Hello and welcome back to the series of ESP methodology. Today we move to Module 5, which is about approaches to and steps in ESP course design. As the name suggested, two main contents are covered, including 3 approaches to ESP course design, followed by the process of designing an ESP course. Let's begin. Course design is the process of interpreting the raw data about a learning need to produce an integrated series of teaching and learning experiences. The ultimate goal is to help learners achieve a certain level of competence. A course could be designed followed by many different approaches, which can be categorized into 3 main types, namely the language-centered approach, skill-based approach, and learning-centered approach. Let's get to know the language-centered approach. This is known as the simplest kind of course design process, and probably the most familiar to English teachers. This approach aims at drawing a direct connection between the analysis of target situation and the content of an ESP course. Learners studied how the language works and practice putting language species together. A syllabus based on language-centered approach highlights the structure of a discourse, including subject-specific words, subtechnical words, and many common core words as well. According to Hutchinson and Waters, 1987, this approach includes 6 steps. By understanding learners' target situation and selecting the appropriate language theory, a course designer can identify linguistic features of the target situation, then create syllabus, design materials to exemplify syllabus items, and finally, establish evaluation procedures to test the acquisition of syllabus items. This approach seems to be logical at best, but in fact, it is criticized because of numbers of weaknesses. Firstly, the framework might look like a learner-centered approach since it starts from the learners and their needs. Instead of teaching the whole English to the learners, language-centered approach just provides a restricted area of language. The learners are used simply as a means of identifying the target situation. Secondly, this approach is criticized for being a static and inflexible procedure. Once the target situational analysis is done, the course designer is locked into a relentless process. Thirdly, it passes a false belief that learning itself is systematic. Certainly, the matter of systematization of knowledge plays an important role in the learning process. But the matter here is that it must be internally generated system, not an externally imposed system. In short, the logical straightforward appeal of the language-centered approach is its weakness, because it fails to recognize the fact that learners being people, learning is not a straightforward, logical process. Skill-based is the second approach that is commonly applied by course designers. In this approach, language is viewed in terms of how the learner's mind processes it, and the learners are seen as the user of language instead of merely learners. This approach is based on 2 fundamental principles. Firstly, the basic theoretical hypothesis is that the underlying any language behaviors are certain skills and strategies which the learners used in order to produce or comprehend discourse. Skill-based approach aims at determining the competence that underlies performance. Secondly, the pragmatic basis for this approach derives from a distinction made by Witterson, 1981, between goal-oriented course and process-oriented course. The skill-centered model aims at not to provide a specified corpus of linguistic knowledge, but to make the learners into better processors of information. The learning content includes a collection of particular skills that may play a role in using language. Specifically, the skill-based syllabus merged language competencies, including pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar, and discourse, into general types of behavior, such as listening to spoken language for main ideas, writing a well-organized paragraph, etc. After identifying the target situation, a course designer analyzes the required skills and strategies for that situation. Together with the choice of language and learning theory, an ESP syllabus is designed, followed by practices and the evaluation procedures. Needs analysis plays an important role in the skill-based approach. Firstly, it provides a basis for discovering the underlying competence that enables people to transform in the target situation. Secondly, it enables the course designer to discover the potential knowledge and abilities that the learners bring to ESP classroom. The skill-based approach is believed to take the learners more into account than the language-centered approach because 1. It views language in terms of how the mind of the learners process it. 2. It tries to view on positive factors that the learners bring to the course. And 3. It frames its objective in open-ended terms, so enabling learners to achieve at least something. Let's spend 2 minutes looking at this image and note down your ideas for the following questions. Which approach to course design is reflected by the image? What are the roles of the learners in this approach? What can a teacher do to boost the learning in this classroom? Hutchinson and Waters argued that too much attention was given to language needed in the language-centered and skill-based approaches. Therefore, the learning-centered approach is proposed to convey learners from the starting point of the target situation after being identified. Learners' needs are approached from 2 directions, namely target needs in analyzing the target situation and learning needs in analyzing learning situation. Target needs are what the learners need to do in the target situation, according to Hutchinson and Waters, 1987. They are broken into 3 categories as we have already known: necessities, lacks, and wants. Necessities are what the learner has to know in order to function effectively in the target situation. Lacks are the gap between what the learners know and the necessities. And wants are what the learners think they need. The second focus of this approach is on learning needs, referring to numerous factors, including who the learners are, their social cultural background, learning background, age, gender, background knowledge of specialized content, background knowledge of English, attitudes towards English, attitudes towards culture of English-speaking world, and studying English. In language-centered approach, target situational analysis is the nature of target situation performance. It is allowed to determine the content of an ESP course without referencing to the learners. In the skill-based approach, target situational analysis is not enough. We must look behind the target performance data to discover what processes enable someone to perform. Those processes will determine the course design. However, This approach does not fully take the learners into account because it still makes the ESP learning situation dependent in the target situation. Or in other words, learners are used to identify and analyze the target situation needs. The learning-centered approach believes that it is not enough. We must look beyond the competence that enables someone to perform. Because what we really want to discover is not the competence itself, but how someone applies that competence. As compared to the other two approaches, the Learning Center approach takes learners into account at every stage of the design process. There are two implications here. Firstly, course design is a negotiated process. The ESP learning situation and the target situation both influence the choice of syllabus, materials, methodology, and evaluation. Secondly, course design is a dynamic process. Needs and resources vary within time. Therefore, course design needs to have a built-in feedback channel to enable the course to respond to development. Let's take an example of an ESP course in which learners need English to be able to read text in their subject specialism. There is no need to write, speak, or listen to English. If the language-centered approach or the skill-based approach is utilized, the ESP lesson would concern themselves only with the activity of reading text. There would be no listening task. All discussion would be in the native language, and writing tasks would be minimal. But if we took the learning process approach, we would need to ask more questions before determining the content and methodology. For example, can we learn to read effectively by reading only, or can other skills help the learners become a better reader? What are the purposes of having a mono-skill focus? Will it lead to a lack of variety or even boredom in the learners? What is the learner's preference? A variety of skills with interest, or just reading? Do the resources in the classroom allow the use of other skills? Who will the learners react to discussing things in mother tongue? How will the learners' attitudes vary through the course? How do the learners feel about reading as an activity? Is it something they really like to do or to avoid? The answers may vary according to the individual situation. The important point is that these questions must be raised since the answer to those influence the course design.